Hi, this is Liane from South Lanarkshire Leisure and Culture. Today the workshop is going to be how to make a cloth face mask with elasticated ear loops. Okay, so the pattern that I'm going to use today is from a website called Craft Passion, and there's a lot of different types of mask patterns available, but this one is really popular. It's been used a lot and it's very straightforward to make. And this is the beak style mask. So the first thing you need to do for the mask is to cut 2 pieces of fabric for the outside piece and 2 pieces of fabric for the lining piece using, you can see the templates, slightly different sizes. So the easiest way to do this is to cut on the fold. So if you're using a patterned fabric, you'd fold your fabric the right sides in, because when you mark it, it means that any marking isn't going to show on the right side of the fabric. To mark this, I've used a fabric pen. You could also use Dressmaking tailor's chalk. So I'll show you how to draw around this one. Fold in the fabric. You can see that the fabric is, the grain of the fabric is important to keep in the right direction. Okay, so it's important to keep the grain of the fabric in the right direction. This fabric has been ripped, so we know that it's gone along the grain of the thread, and on the mask you'll see there is a grain line marked, so we need to just make sure that that lines up and is parallel to the grain line. Can you see if I'm doing it down here? Okay, right, so I'm going to lay that on the fabric, again just making sure that's parallel. I've cut these out of card because that way it's just much quicker if you're going to be making quite a lot of masks. The paper template, if you have to keep pinning the paper template on the bit of fabric, eventually it will get torn from the pins, so it's worth just getting anything like a cereal packet or a shoebox and just cutting out a paper template, a cardboard template. It's worth just cutting out a cardboard template. So that's there. So I'm going to use my fabric scissors and just cut round the masks. So I'm going to be cutting through both layers so you end up with the left side and the right hand side. My tips for using scissors to cut out fabric is, if ideally you would have a separate pair of scissors, because paper really blunts scissors. So if you can have a pair that you use just for fabric, that really helps to keep them sharp, and that makes cutting a lot easier. So I'm aiming for like the middle of the line. This bit's slightly trickier, the tip of the mask. So just keep focusing on the middle of the line. Don't try and use the whole length of the scissors, just use as much as you feel comfortable that it's sharp, and you get a nice smooth line that way. So you can see I'm opening and closing the scissors quite regularly. If at this point, if you feel like it's moving, you could always put a couple of clips or pins in the fabric just to keep the 2 sides together. And just take your time, there's no need to rush the cutting. It's always definitely worth taking your time to get a good shape, and that'll make the sewing a bit easier down the line. So you can see that I've now got a left and a right, and we're ready to put the left side and the right side together. So if you were using a patterned piece, it would be really important to make sure that you have the patterns facing right sides in, so that when you sew, you end up with a neat seam on the outside. So to fasten them together, it's just this central curved seam that we're going to do first. Just going to take my time to get that lined up. You could use pins, or I'm going to use these magic clips because they're very easy to take off. So just clipping down the length of the seam. So the pattern says to use an 1/8 of an inch seam, which is about like 3 or 4 millimeters. I found that's quite a small seam to sew, so I'm actually just going to do it slightly larger. I'm going to adjust the machine so it's not on the very left hand stitch, it's on the right hand stitch, and I'm going to line up the inside of this metal bar with the edge of the mask here. But if you, on your own machine, there'll be stitch marks on the machine that you can just play about with it and get the right amount that you're happy with. Okay, if you really would prefer to just mark, you could use a ruler and just mark on the seam, and you could draw it all the way around if you wanted to give yourself a guide. Okay, so I'm going to set off and stitch this. I'm actually going to just start a little bit further down because it's quite delicate at the top of where the mask points. I'm just going to start with a couple of stitches, then I'm going to reverse and go right the way to the end. Starting with a curve, so curves aren't always the easiest to follow, but I think you just point the corner of the foot at the edge of the curve and that should keep it fairly even. Okay, so that's the mask stitched together on the front center seam. Okay, so I've got this one ready here that I've already done. So the next thing to do is, you can see that you've got the 2 seams. I'm just going to trim these threads and we're going to lay the 2 mask pieces together now. And before you do that, it's just important to press the seams so that one seam should be facing left. I'm just going to do a finger crease, but you can do this with the iron. So I'm pressing this one to the left. I'm going to lay that down, and then I'm going to take this one and I'm going to press it the opposite way. So I'm going to press this seam to the right, and this is just to reduce any bulkiness at the center seam because that bit's going to be resting over the nose, so we don't want it really bulky. Okay, I just realised I pressed that the wrong way. So I'm going to press that so it's going the opposite way of this one when it's laid down. So I'm laying the right sides together, so you'll see on either side there's the seams. Okay, and we just line up the seams and pin or clip along the edges. Okay, so that's going one way and this is pointing the other way. Just going to make sure that's lined up again at the top, facing the opposite way. You'll notice the top ones, they do point over the edge a little bit, but don't worry about that. I'll probably trim that off once we've stitched the seams together. Okay. And then pin this side, and you'll notice that there's like an extra bit of fabric at the end, and that is going to be the pieces that we're going to fold over to make into the channels for the ear elastic. Right, so once you've done that, it will look something like this, and we're going to stitch along the top seam and we're going to stitch along the bottom seam, leaving the ends here open. So again, I think it recommends to use 1/8 of an inch, but I'm just going to do slightly bigger because I found that it doesn't affect the fit of the mask too much. So reverse at the start to anchor the stitch. Okay, when you get to this bit, just make sure your seams are sitting flat and lined up. Little reverse at the end, and that's one side sewn. And now for the top seam. Faster. Again, this is the tricky bit, just making sure that this is pointing the way you want it to go and that the underneath centre seam is pointing the opposite direction to avoid the bulk. Seams moved a bit there, but I don't think that'll affect it too much at the end. So, right, so that's both seams sewn and the pocket is still open. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do, I'm just going to use this one because I've already trimmed the threads. And like I say, if you want to, you can trim, just to reduce bulkiness, you can trim these little points off here. The seam's so small, it doesn't really matter about notching or trimming any extra away. If you're using a very wide seam, I would recommend that, but for this project it's okay. So we're just going to turn it through. And then it starts to look a bit more like the finished product. So you can see that if you've used a contrast lining, a little bit of it's showing. So just at this point, either with an iron or finger crease, just make sure that the seam is really pressed out. And if you like, just slightly position the outside of the fabric higher than the lining of the fabric, because that way you don't see the lining when it's finished. Okay, pressing up those seams. So I've got one here that I've already pressed out, so I'm going to then stitch up these elastic channels, and this one's got them already done. This one I've stitched one side of the elastic channel, and this is the length here. So you can see that this, where you've got your stitch line, it's already starting to suggest where the seam needs to go, so just iron or finger crease this. This top bit here, what I've found is it's better to take it down at more of a diagonal angle, because then you don't see any of the fabric showing. The raw edge of the fabric shows if you just keep it very straight like this. If it was like higher, you end up seeing some of that. So that's just to keep it looking really neat, go more of a diagonal line. You're then going to take it and crease or iron about 1/2 centimetre, like that. And I'm then going to take that over, and I want to make sure that it goes over this raw edge, because then obviously we're going to be washing the masks multiple times, so any raw edges are best to be kept tucked in. So I've just clipped this, and I'm then going to stitch just quite close to this edge here. So again, on your individual machine, just line it up, just get it quite close to the edge. So I'm going to use this this side as the guide this time, and I'm going to move the needle over. This isn't essential, but it's just a feature of this machine that it just makes it a very close stitch. Again, I'm going to reverse at the start and the end. Slightly thicker fabric, so the machine's making a bit more noise. Okay, and so you can see that that's stitched, but we've got this opening here ready to put the elastic in. Okay, so for the elastic, if you cut 20 centimeters or 8 inches of the elastic, and any type of elastic's fine. The really thin elastic tends to not be as comfortable. This is something that I was ordered in. It's a little bit more soft and more cottony. You can use t-shirt yarn, just various things that will be a bit softer. Or the flat, like 1/4 inch elastic is a good size. So I've just put a safety pin on the end, and I'm going to just thread that through. The safety pin just gives you something to get hold of as you push it through the channel. It's a little bit tricky at this top bit. Sometimes it can get stuck underneath the seam, so just ease it through. And then you've got both ends. I'm going to take the safety pin off. I'm just gonna tie a loop. At this point you can actually fit it to whatever's comfortable for you. Adjust the length of the elastic, so it's like that. Sometimes if it's tighter it will look quite gathered up, and then you can then hide that knot by just easing it round and just hiding it inside the seam so it looks neater. And then I'll do that on the other side, and then that is the mask finished. And they're washable. Thank you for participating in the workshop, and I hope you enjoy it.